Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The full moon was a merciless eye in the black sky, and its light was a judgment. It spilled over the great clearing, turning the ancient standing stones to silver bones and the packed earth to a stage for my failure. The air was thick with the scent of pine, damp soil, and the electric tang of shifting magic, a magic that had always refused me. I stood in the center of the summoning circle, my bare feet numb against the cold, worn granite, my thin linen shift doing little to ward off the biting wind that whispered through the towering redwoods. It was a familiar ghost, this cold. It lived in my bones. Around me, the pack was a symphony of glorious violence. The sounds were etched into my soul. The wet crack of bone reshaping, the stretching of sinew, the guttural groans that deepened into resonant growls. One by one, they shed their human skins, their bodies breaking and remaking themselves into the magnificent beasts of our lineage. First the young males, eager and reckless, their transformations messy and loud. Then the she-wolves, their shifts more fluid, a dance of muscle and fur under the lunar gaze. Finally, the elders, their changes quiet, practiced, and profound. Soon, the clearing was filled with wolves. Their fur ranged from sable to silver, their eyes glowing with amber and gold fire. They paced, they snapped playfully, they raised their muzzles to the sky and howled a song of belonging I could only ever listen to from the outside. And I, Ilaris Thornvale, remained, human, small, broken. A ripple of cruel laughter came from a knot of young alphas near the edge of the circle. Kyle, his gray wolf form, already larger than the others, let out a derisive snort. "Still waiting for your miracle, little Omega," he sent through the pack's shared mind link, a voice of gravel and scorn that scraped against my thoughts. The words were a physical blow. I flinched, wrapping my arms around myself. My throat, as always, was locked tight. Mute since my first failed shifting ceremony at 16, I had no voice to answer, human or otherwise. I could only stand there and take it, my gaze fixed on the symbol carved into the stone at my feet. A wolf curled around a crescent moon, a promise of a power I did not possess. The elders watched me from their perch on a moss-covered ledge, their expressions a mixture of pity and stony disapproval. Elder Maeve, her silver-pelted wolf, sitting with regal stillness, held my gaze for a moment. I saw no hope there, only a deep, weary sorrow. I was a flaw in their bloodline, a genetic dead end, a constant, shameful reminder of imperfection. My heart hammered a frantic, useless rhythm against my ribs. "Please," I begged the silent thing inside me, the hollow space where a wolf was supposed to be, tonight. "Please, just answer me." I closed my eyes, focusing on the moon's pull, the thrum of power in the earth, the primal heartbeat of the pack all around me. I reached for something, anything, a spark, a growl, a flicker of instinct. Nothing. Only the vast, silent emptiness I had known for 8 long years. The laughter grew louder. A she-wolf, Lyra, trotted forward and nudged a dead branch towards my feet with her nose. "Maybe you can fetch, wolfless one. It's the most use you'll be." Tears burned behind my eyes, hot and sharp. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. Shame was a cloak I wore so often it felt like a second skin. It was woven from their mockery, their pity, the averted gazes, the whispers that I was barren, cursed, an Omega in name only, lacking even the grace of a true submissive spirit. I was just incomplete. Suddenly the howling stopped. A tension, sharp and unnatural, sliced through the air. The wolves froze, their heads snapping up, noses twitching. The playful energy vanished, replaced by a low, unified growl that rumbled from dozens of chests. The air grew heavy. The familiar scent of pine was tainted by something else. Something acrid and wrong. Iron, wolfsbane. The cold, metallic sweat of human fear twisted with hatred. Hunters. A silver-tipped arrow hissed out of the darkness and slammed into the shoulder of a young wolf near the edge of the clearing. He yelped, a piercing cry of pain, and stumbled. The accursed metal already smoking where it touched his flesh. Chaos erupted. The pack exploded into a whirlwind of fury and instinct. Snarls ripped through the night as dark shapes emerged from the tree line. Men clad in boiled leather and armed with silver-laced crossbows and blades. They were disciplined, moving in a tight formation, their faces grim under the moonlight. I was frozen in the center of the clearing, a perfect target. The swirling battle of fur and steel was all around me, a terrifying storm of which I was the helpless eye. A hunter broke through the line, his eyes, cold and human, locking onto mine. He saw what I was, not a threat, but an easy mark, a wolfless wolf. He grinned, a cruel slash in his bearded face, and raised his crossbow. Time seemed to slow. I saw the glint of the bolt, the tautness of the string, the malice in his gaze. There was nowhere to run. My legs wouldn't move. My silent scream died in my throat. This is it, I thought, a strange calm washing over the terror. This is how the broken thing finally shatters. The bowstring twanged. Searing, white-hot agony tore through my side. I gasped, a ragged, choked sound, and looked down. An arrow shaft protruded from my ribs, its silver head buried deep. The pain was absolute, a fire that consumed every nerve, and the scent of my own blood filled my nostrils. I crumpled to my knees, my hands weakly pressing against the wound as my life poured out onto the cold stone. The hunter advanced, drawing a long silver knife, his grin widening. Around me the fight raged, but here, in my small circle of death, there was only him. He stood over me, the moonlight catching the edge of his blade. "An Omega," he grunted, his voice rough. "Weak. Good for nothing but dying." He raised the knife. I stared up at the moon, its light blurring through a haze of pain and tears. I was going to die here, in the heart of my pack, as helpless as I had lived. The emptiness inside me, the silent space where my wolf should have been, suddenly felt like a cavernous, aching void. All my life I had begged for a wolf. I had pleaded with the moon, the ancestors, any god that might listen. Now, with death's cold hand on my throat, I didn't beg. I didn't plead. I raged. A scream, silent and raw, ripped through my soul. No, it wasn't a thought. It was a command that echoed not in my mind, but in the very marrow of my bones. The world went white with pain, and then a deeper darkness swallowed it whole. Something inside me didn't just stir. It broke. It shattered its cage of flesh and bone, with a violence that felt like my soul was being torn in two. It was not the clean practice shift of the pack. There was no cracking of bone, no stretching of muscle. There was only an unraveling. I felt my physical form dissolve, my consciousness atomizing into 1,000 points of screaming energy. The hunter above me faltered, his grin twisting into confusion, then horror. The air around me dropped 20 degrees, and the moonlight seemed to bend, to warp around a growing epicenter of absolute blackness that was me. Shadows, thick and tangible as ink, poured from my wound, from my mouth, from my eyes. They coiled and writhed, not forming a wolf, but something far older, something that had no name in the pack's lore. A shape coalesced from the night itself, a creature of living darkness, its form vaguely canine but impossibly large, its edges flickering and unstable like a flame in the wind. 2 embers ignited within the void of its head, eyes of smoldering fire that held no mercy, only an ancient bottomless hunger. The hunter screamed. It was a high, thin sound, instantly cut short. A claw made of solidified shadow, tipped with burning cinders, swiped through the air. It didn't just cut him, it unmade him. He dissolved into a spray of ash and a puff of terrified vapor. The creature that was me, that was born of my dying rage, turned its smoldering gaze upon the other hunters. They saw it. Their disciplined lines broke. Their bravado evaporated, replaced with primal, shrieking terror. This was not the enemy they had trained for. This was a nightmare given form. It moved with impossible speed, a blur of shadow and embers, and where it passed, there was only silence and drifting ash. It did not tear them apart. It erased them. I was aware of it all from a great floating distance, a passenger in my own body, watching a god of destruction wear my soul. I felt its rage, its power, its profound, ageless loneliness. And then, as the last hunter vanished into nothing, the power receded. The shadows collapsed back inward, pouring into me like smoke being sucked into a bottle. The fiery eyes dimmed. I slammed back into my body with a gasp. I was on my knees in the center of the clearing, drenched in my own blood, the hunter's arrow still embedded in my side. The world swam back into focus. The clearing was silent, utterly terrifyingly silent. The surviving hunters were gone. In their place, patches of scorched earth and swirling motes of fine gray ash drifted on the wind. My pack was still there. They stood in a wide, unbroken circle around me, their wolf forms rigid with a fear I had never seen. The brutes who had mocked me were flattened to the ground, whimpering, their tails tucked so far between their legs they trembled. The elders on the ledge were stiff with shock, their ancient eyes wide with disbelief and horror. Every single gaze was fixed on me, not with mockery, not with pity, with pure, unadulterated terror. They were looking at me as if I were the monster. A path parted through them. A presence fell over the clearing, so immense and heavy, it felt like the mountain itself was leaning in to watch. It silenced the wind and stole the breath from my lungs. Every wolf, without exception, lowered their head, baring their necks in submission. He walked into the moonlight. King Malrik, the alpha of alphas. His wolf was a creature of legend, a beast the size of a pony, with fur the color of a thundercloud, and eyes that held the cold, silver light of a distant star. A jagged scar ran from his brow, over his left eye, a mark left by a rival king he had torn apart years ago. He was power incarnate, the undisputed heart of the pack, and his presence demanded fealty. He stalked slowly, deliberately toward me, his massive paws making no sound on the stone. The pack held its collective breath. I was an abomination, a wolfless omega who had just unleashed a forbidden, soul-destroying power. He was the king. He was here to deliver judgment. He was here to end me. I trembled, too weak to move, and waited for the bite that would sever my spine. He stopped directly in front of me, his shadow eclipsing the moon. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the scent of pine, ozone, and ancient stone that clung to him like a shroud. I forced my head up, meeting his scarred, terrifying gaze one last time. But there was no snarl on his great muzzle. His teeth were not bared. He looked from my bleeding, broken human form to the circles of ash that littered the clearing, and a low sound rumbled in his chest. It was not a growl of aggression. It was something deeper, something that sounded like wonder and dread. Then, before the horrified eyes of the entire pack, the great King Malrik, the alpha of alphas, slowly, deliberately lowered his massive head. He bent his powerful front legs and dipped his muzzle to the ground before me, in the ancient, undeniable posture of a wolf, acknowledging a power greater than its own. The posture of absolute submission. The silence that followed was a living thing. It was heavier than the mountain, colder than the moon, and it pressed down on the clearing with the weight of 1,000 broken traditions. A collective shudder went through the pack, a single visible wave of disbelief. Their alpha, their king, the embodiment of their strength and pride, was bowed before the broken, wolfless omega. It was blasphemy. It was madness. My mind, reeling from pain and the phantom echo of that monstrous power, couldn't process it. My vision swam. The world was a blur of silver light and dark, terrified shapes. I saw Kyle, the brute who had mocked me, his powerful gray wolf form trembling so violently he looked as if he might come apart. I saw Lyra, her amber eyes wide with a terror that was almost worshipful. They were not looking at a king humbling himself. They were watching him appease a vengeful god that had, moments before, worn my skin. Veyron remained bowed for 3 heartbeats, 3 eternities that rewrote every law of our existence. Then, with a fluid grace that belied his immense size, he rose. He did not look at his pack. His gaze, those chilling silver eyes, fell upon me and did not waver. The judgment was gone, replaced by an intensity that burned hotter than any fire. It was a look of assessment, of possession, of a terrifying, ancient recognition. He took another step forward, and I flinched, a pathetic whimper catching in my throat. The agony in my side flared, a sharp reminder of the silver still buried in my flesh. His eyes flickered down to the arrow shaft, to the dark blood staining my thin shift and the pale skin of my stomach. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound so deep and resonant it vibrated through the stone beneath me. It was not directed at me. It was a promise of annihilation for the men who had dared to harm me. Ignoring the 60 frozen wolves watching his every move, he lowered his massive head again. This time it was not in submission. His jaws, capable of snapping bone like kindling, opened with impossible gentleness. He nudged my shoulder with his nose, a clear instruction. I was too weak to resist, too stunned to do anything but collapse sideways. With the care of a wolf carrying her own pup, he clamped his teeth onto the fabric of my shift at my shoulder and hip, lifting me from the ground as if I weighed nothing. A collective gasp, silent but felt, rippled through the pack mind. The king was carrying the Omega, not dragging her to judgment, but carrying her to safety. My world became a dizzying collage of sensations. The sharp, searing pain in my side was a constant, but it was wrapped in the shocking reality of my situation. My head rested against the thick, coarse fur of his neck. The scent of him was overwhelming, pine needles crushed after a storm, the sharp tang of ozone, and the cold, clean smell of granite from the heart of the mountain. It was the scent of power, of dominance, of the very earth we lived on. Beneath it all, I could feel the thrum of his life, the slow, powerful beat of his heart against my cheek. He turned and began to walk, his stride long and deceptively smooth. The pack parted before him like water around a boulder. No one met his eyes. He carried me out of the circle of ash, away from the scene of my humiliation and my horrifying transformation, and into the deep woods. The shadows of the ancient redwoods fell over us, and the sounds of the clearing faded behind us, leaving only the soft padding of his paws on the damp earth and the ragged whisper of my own breathing. I closed my eyes, succumbing to the encroaching darkness. The last thing I felt was the impossible safety of being held in the jaws of the most dangerous predator I had ever known. I drifted, lost in a fever dream of shadows and fire. I felt the creature inside me again, not raging, but sleeping. It was a vast, coiled thing, its slumbering breath the source of the dull hum beneath my skin. It had saved me, and it had damned me. Consciousness returned in sharp, painful jolts. I was aware of being laid down on something soft, a bed of furs that smelled of cedar and dried herbs. The air was warm, thick with the scent of smoke, and something medicinal and bitter. I cracked my eyes open. I was in a cave, but it was unlike the damp, simple dens of the other pack members. The walls were smooth, carved with faint spirals and ancient runes that seemed to shimmer in the flickering firelight. This was a place of power, the healer's den. Elder Maeve was standing over me, her human form as regal and imposing as her wolf's. Her long silver hair was braided with raven feathers, her face a mask of deep lines and profound gravity. Her eyes, a startlingly pale blue, held a mixture of clinical focus and deep, abiding fear. But her fear was different from the pack's. It was the fear of a scholar who has just found proof of a legend she had only ever dared to read about. "She is burning with fever, my king," Maeve said, her voice a low, steady hum. "The silver is poisoning her blood." My gaze shifted. He was there, Varen. He stood near the fire, his back to me, but I knew it was him. The sheer breadth of his shoulders, the aura of coiled stillness that surrounded him. He dominated the space even when he was not moving, and he was human. As I watched, he turned, and for the first time, I saw the alpha of alphas in his mortal skin. He was even more formidable than his wolf. Tall and brutally sculpted, his body was a tapestry of muscle and scars. The moonlight from the cave entrance caught the silver streaks in his dark hair and traced the jagged scar that cut through his eyebrow, giving his face a permanent look of severity. He wore simple leather breeches and nothing else, his chest and arms exposed. The scars there were not blemishes, but history written on skin, the marks of claws, blades, and teeth. But it was his eyes that held me captive. They were the same startling silver as his wolf's, and they seemed to see straight through my flesh to the terrified soul, and the slumbering monster curled around it. He met my gaze, and the world seemed to stop. The king's silence was a physical presence in the cave. He didn't need to speak. His stare communicated everything: command, possession, and unnerving curiosity. "Hold her down," he said to Maeve, and his voice was exactly as I'd imagined, like rocks grinding together deep within the earth. A sound of immense pressure and ancient power. Maeve placed her cool, firm hands on my shoulders. "This will hurt, child," she whispered, her calm tone a stark contrast to the terror I saw in her eyes. "Do not fight it." Varen knelt beside me, a long, thin-bladed silver knife in his hand, a tool not of a warrior, but of a surgeon. He moved with an unnerving precision, his large, calloused hands surprisingly steady. He pressed down on the flesh around the arrow, his touch sending a jolt of fire and ice through my system. I cried out, a strangled, voiceless sound, my back arching off the furs. "Steady," Varen commanded, his silver eyes locked on his task. He didn't look at my face, but I felt his gaze on me all the same, a heavy, possessive weight. With a swift, brutal motion, he sliced the skin around the arrowhead, widening the wound. The pain was a white-hot nova that exploded behind my eyes. I thrashed, a scream tearing at my useless throat. The shadow inside me stirred, a growl echoing not in the cave, but in the deepest corners of my mind. It wanted out. It wanted to unmake the source of my pain. "Elaris, control it!" Maeve's voice was sharp, laced with panic. "Do not let it wake!" Varen's hand shot out and clamped down on my wrist, his grip like a manacle of iron. "Be still," he ordered, his voice dropping into a low growl that was pure alpha command. It bypassed my conscious mind and struck something deep within me, something primal and submissive that had never awakened before. My body obeyed against my will, the trembling lessening, though the pain remained a blinding sheet of white. He worked quickly then, using a pair of iron pliers to grip the slick, bloody shaft of the arrow. "On 3, he said to Maeve. 1, 2. He didn't wait for 3. He wrenched the arrow out in one swift, violent pull. A real scream, raw and ragged, finally tore from my throat. It was the first sound I had made in 8 years. It was a sound of pure agony. Black spots danced in my vision as the world tilted and spun. The last thing I saw before I fainted was Varen dropping the bloody, silver-tipped arrow into a bowl with a clang and staring down at me, his expression unreadable, his silver eyes burning like twin winter stars. When I woke again, the cave was quiet. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The agonizing pain in my side had subsided to a deep, throbbing ache. I looked down. My wound had been cleaned and packed with a dark, pungent poultice of herbs, then tightly bound with clean linen. I was covered by a heavy fur blanket that smelled of Varen. I was alone, or so I thought. "You are awake." His voice came from the shadows near the entrance of the cave. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, my heart hammering against my freshly bandaged ribs. Varen stepped into the dim firelight. He held a wooden bowl of water, which he set down on a small stone table beside me. He moved with a predator's silence, a deliberate economy of motion that spoke of immense power held in careful reserve. I just stared at him, my mind a blank slate of fear and exhaustion. My voice, which had broken free in a scream of pain, was gone again, my throat a locked vault of silence. He sat on a stone ledge across from me, the space between us charged with unspoken questions. He didn't demand answers, he simply watched me, his scarred face a mask of stone in the dying light of the fire. The silence stretched, becoming a language of its own. In it, I felt his power, his authority, and something else. Something that felt dangerously like a claim being laid. He was not my alpha in the traditional sense anymore. He was my keeper, my warden. Finally, after what felt like an hour, he spoke again. "The pack is afraid," he stated, his voice low and flat. It was not an accusation, but a simple declaration of fact. "The elders are speaking of the old texts, of the Askawarger, the Shadow Wolf, a creature of myth, a spirit of destruction that wears the skin of our people." My blood ran cold. Askawarger. The name was a whisper from a nightmare, a story told to frighten pups, a legend of a power so great it consumed its host and laid waste to entire bloodlines. It was a curse. "They believe the hunters did not awaken it," he continued, his silver eyes never leaving mine. "They believe your inability to shift was never a weakness. It was a cage, and the silver arrow was the key that unlocked the door." He leaned forward, resting his powerful forearms on his knees. The firelight carved deep shadows into the planes of his face, making him look like a primeval king carved from the mountain itself. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only watch him, trapped in the intensity of his gaze. "The pack will fear what they do not understand," he said, his voice dropping even lower, a gravelly rumble that sent a tremor through my bones. "They will call you a curse. They will want you exiled or dead. From this moment on, you are under my protection." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the silent cave. His eyes burned into mine, and in their silver depths, I saw not just the king, but the wolf. Possessive, territorial, absolute. "You belong to me." The words were not a promise of safety. They were the sound of a cage door locking. For 8 years, I had belonged to the pack in the way a broken tool belongs in a dusty corner, an object of shame and pity, easily discarded. Now I belonged to the king. It was a different kind of ownership, heavier, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. I spent the next day and night in the healing den, drifting in and out of a feverish sleep. Maeve tended to my wound with practiced hands, her face a mask of grim duty. She changed the poultice, forced bitter teas between my lips, and never, ever met my eyes for more than a fleeting second. When she thought I was asleep, I heard her chanting softly in the old tongue, words of binding and warding, as if trying to shore up the spiritual walls of the cave against the thing that slept inside my flesh. Varen did not return, but his presence lingered. It was in the heavy fur that covered me, saturated with his scent of pine and ozone. It was in the respectful distance the rest of the pack kept from the den, as if an invisible line had been drawn around it, a line they dared not cross. His claim was a brand, unseen but felt by all. On the morning of the second day, the fever broke. I awoke feeling hollowed out and weak, but the fire in my blood had cooled to embers. The first thing I was aware of was a new scent in the cave, overriding the medicinal herbs and smoke. It was the rich, savory smell of roasted rabbit. My stomach clenched with a hunger so sharp it was a pain in itself. I pushed myself up, my muscles screaming in protest, my bandaged side a deep, throbbing ache. He was there, sitting on the same stone ledge as before, a skewer of cooked meat in one hand and a steaming bowl of broth in the other. He had watched me sleep. The thought sent a chill down my spine. that had nothing to do with the morning air. He rose without a word and came to my bedside. He placed the offerings on the stone table, his movements economical and precise. He was not a caregiver. He was a keeper, checking on his new volatile asset. I stared at the food, then up at his scarred, unreadable face. My throat was raw, but the lock of silence felt as tight as ever. "Eat," he commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. My hands trembled as I reached for the bowl of broth. It was warm and rich, and as the liquid soothed my throat and filled my empty stomach, a sliver of strength returned. He watched me, his silver eyes missing nothing, the slight tremor of my hands, the way I avoided his gaze, the pallor of my skin. He was assessing me, gauging my recovery, my state of mind. I felt like a wild animal being tamed, my every move scrutinized for weakness or aggression. When I finished the broth and had eaten some of the tender meat, he took the empty bowl and skewer from me. The silence stretched again, thick and heavy with unspoken things. I could feel the creature inside me, the Aska Warger, stirring in its deep slumber. It was a low hum in my bones, a faint pressure behind my eyes. It wasn't threatening. It was simply there, a permanent part of my internal landscape, a shadow coiled around my soul. "We are leaving," Varen said, turning towards the cave entrance. Panic seized me. "Leave?" The word was a choked, rusty whisper, the first sound I'd willingly made. It hurt my throat, but the shock of hearing my own voice was even greater. He paused, his back still to me, but I could feel his attention sharpen. "You cannot hide in this cave forever," he said, without turning around. "The pack must see that you are not a monster to be slain. They must see that you are mine." He turned then, and the full force of his gaze pinned me to the furs. "They will fear you," he stated, his voice devoid of sympathy. "But they will obey me. Get dressed." He tossed a bundle of soft, tan doe hide onto the bed, a simple tunic and leggings, clean and practical. He left the cave, granting me a sliver of privacy that felt more like a calculated tactic than a kindness. I dressed slowly, my body aching with every movement. The new clothes were soft against my skin, a world away from the threadbare omega shifts I was used to. This was not the clothing of a pariah. It was the clothing of someone kept. When I emerged from the healing den, blinking in the bright morning sun, he was waiting. He stood in his human form, a silent, intimidating sentinel. The pack settlement was nestled in a wide valley, a collection of sturdy dens built into the hillsides and timber lodges clustered around a central fire pit. At this time of day, it should have been bustling with activity. Instead, it was eerily quiet. Figures froze in doorways, pups were quickly pulled inside. The normal sounds of pack life, chatter, laughter, the yapping of young wolves, were absent. Fear was a stench, sharp and sour, and it clung to every member of my pack. As Varen started walking, I had no choice but to follow, my bare feet sinking into the soft earth. I kept my eyes down, but I could feel their gazes on me. Dozens of them. I felt their terror, their hatred, their confusion. It was a barrage of silent condemnation that was 1,000 times worse than their old mockery. Kale stood near the armory, his massive, muscled form rigid. He didn't sneer. He didn't even look at me. He stared at a spot on the ground just past my feet, his knuckles white where he gripped a wooden spear, his neck bowed in a gesture of forced submission to the king who walked beside me. Lyra, who had been gossiping with 2 other she-wolves, fell silent as we approached. They scurried away like startled rabbits, casting terrified glances over their shoulders. I was a walking plague, a ghost, and Varen was my keeper, parading me through the village to normalize the horror I represented. He walked at my side, not close enough to touch, but his presence was a shield and a wall. He was daring anyone to speak, to challenge, to even breathe too loudly in my direction. No one did. Our destination was the Elder's Lodge, the largest and oldest structure, built into the base of the mountain itself. Its entrance was a dark maw, flanked by 2 ancient snarling totems of wood and bone. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of old parchment, dried herbs, and dust. This was the heart of the pack's history, its lore, its laws. Elder Maeve was there, along with 2 other elders, a grizzled male named Phelan and a stern-faced she-wolf, Sorsha. They stood before a massive flat stone table carved with a sprawling map of our territory. Ancient scrolls and bound leather books were piled high on shelves carved into the rock walls. "My king," Phelan said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He bowed his head, but his eyes, when they flicked to me, were hard as flint. Sorsha simply stared, her lips a thin, disapproving line. "Report," Varen commanded, ignoring the tension. "The border patrols have found nothing," Phelan said. "No sign of the hunters' camp. It is as if they were never here. There is only—" He hesitated, glancing at me. "Ash." "The shadow wolf leaves no tracks," Maeve murmured, her gaze distant. She finally looked at me, and I saw the conflict in her eyes. The healer who had tended my wound warring with the lore master, who knew the terrifying truth of what I was. The old texts are clear. The Aska Warger is not a wolf of the pack. It is a force of nature, an antibody of the earth, awakened by a great wound. It does not kill. It purges. It unmakes. "It saved us," Varen stated, his voice cutting through her litany of doom. "It saved us from the hunters, yes," Sorsha countered, her sharp voice cracking like a whip. "But what will save us from it? It is a power without a leash, Varen, a curse in the Thornvale bloodline we thought had died out centuries ago. She is a vessel for a weapon that cannot be controlled." "Then I will control her," Varen said, the words sending an icy shiver down my spine. "You cannot chain the wind," Sorsha snapped, taking a step forward. "You cannot command an earthquake. By all the old laws, she should be cleansed." The word hung in the air, cold and deadly. Cleansed, exiled to die in the wilds, or executed to protect the pack from the abomination she carried. It was what I had expected. It was the logical, lawful thing to do. But Varen moved, placing himself slightly in front of me. It was a subtle shift, but it was an unmistakable gesture of shielding. "The old laws did not account for a king like me," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "She is not a curse. She is a weapon, my weapon. And I will not have my pack cowering in their dens while a new war is brewing on our borders. The hunters who came for us were not simple trappers. They were disciplined. Soldiers, the first wave of something worse. She is the answer to that threat." He was not looking at a girl. He was looking at an asset and deciding how to aim it. The elders fell silent, their arguments dying in the face of his absolute unyielding will. He was their king, but in that moment, he felt like a tyrant, reshaping their world to fit his own designs. He turned to me, his silver eyes boring into mine. "The choice is not yours to make," he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "But you will learn. You will learn to control it, or I will find a way to cage it myself." With that, he turned and stalked out of the lodge, leaving me in the suffocating presence of the elders' fear and hatred. I stood frozen for a moment, the weight of his declaration settling upon me. I was a weapon, a thing to be wielded. I followed him out into the sunlight, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. He didn't return to the center of the village. Instead, he took a steep, winding path that led up the side of the mountain, away from the prying eyes of the pack. The path was treacherous and narrow, but he moved with the easy confidence of a creature born to this terrain. I struggled to keep up, my recovering body protesting, my breath coming in ragged gasps. He led me to a place I had only ever seen from a distance, the King's Eyrie. It was not a den dug into the earth, but a vast, open-faced cavern high on the mountain, protected by a natural overhang of rock. The view is breathtaking, showing the entire valley, the glittering ribbon of the river, and the endless sea of redwood trees stretching to the horizon. This was his sanctuary, his throne room. The interior was sparse. A large bed of the finest wolf and bear pelts lay in one corner. A fire pit, cold now, sat in the center. But what drew my eye were the carvings that covered the back wall. They were ancient, far older than the ones in the healing den, depicting not wolves, but monstrous shadowy beasts fighting against invaders made of fire and light. And in the very center, one carving stood out. It was a wolf-like shape made of pure shadow with eyes like burning stars. At its feet, a figure with a crown of antlers, an ancient king, was bowed in submission, the same way Varen had bowed to me. He saw me staring at it, and a strange expression flickered across his face. "My ancestor," he said, his voice a low rumble that echoed in the vast space. "The first king of this mountain, he did not fight the Askawargur. He bound his bloodline to it, an oath of service in exchange for its protection." My mind whirled. This wasn't just a random curse. It was a legacy, an ancient, terrifying pact. "That oath has been dormant for 1,000 years, he continued, taking a step closer to me. The space between us crackled with energy. "Until you." He stopped directly in front of me, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. His sheer size was overwhelming. He was the mountain, the storm, the unyielding stone, and I was just a girl who had a god of destruction sleeping in her veins. "The elders are wrong," he whispered, his voice a raw, gravelly thing that vibrated through my very core. "I do not want to cage it." He reached out, his calloused fingers tracing the edge of the linen bandage over my wound. His touch was not gentle or healing. It was electric. A jolt, not of pain, but of pure energy shot through me, a circuit being completed between us. The shadow inside me stirred, unfurling like a waking serpent. Drawn to his touch, to his power, I gasped, my eyes flying open to meet his. His pupils were dilated, the silver of his irises burning with a terrifying, possessive light. He was not just touching my wound. He was touching the power within. He was communing with the beast. "I want to unleash it," he breathed, his gaze dropping to my lips. "Show it to me, Alaris. Show me the shadow that bows to no king." His words were a spark thrown on dry tinder. Show me the shadow. He wasn't asking. It was a challenge, a seduction, a command woven into a whisper. His fingers, still tracing the edge of my bandage, sent shivers of something that was not entirely fear through my body. It was a resonance, a humming frequency that vibrated from his touch, through my skin and into the coiled darkness in my soul. The Askawargur responded. It wasn't a conscious decision on my part. The creature inside me, which had been a slumbering weight, now stirred with a distinct, almost curious energy. A faint wisp of black smoke, thin as a spider's thread, curled from my wound, wrapping around his fingers before dissolving into the air. It was a greeting, a recognition. Varen's breath hitched, a barely audible sound. His silver eyes darkened, the pupils expanding until only a thin rim of starlight remained. He saw the smoke, he felt the connection. The corner of his mouth tilted in a smile that was not kind or reassuring. It was the predatory grin of a king who had just found the key to his ultimate weapon. "There," he breathed, his voice a low, hypnotic rumble. "It knows me. It remembers the oath." He leaned closer, his face just inches from mine. The scent of him, pine, ozone, and something wilder, something uniquely him, filled my senses, intoxicating and terrifying. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, charged silence of the eerie. He was too close, too large, too powerful. He consumed all the air, all the space, leaving me nothing. My instincts, the human ones, screamed at me to run, to pull away, but I was frozen, trapped by the sheer force of his will and the mesmerizing pull of his gaze. The shadow inside me had no such fear. It felt no threat from him. It felt a kinship, an ancient alliance awakening in my blood and bones. "They want to chain you," Varen murmured, his gaze dropping to my mouth. "To perform rituals, to bind you with silver and old words. They would see you a prisoner for the rest of your life, a caged monster they could study and fear from a safe distance. He lifted his hand from my side, and I felt the loss of his touch like a sudden chill. He cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking gently over my cheekbone. The gesture was shockingly intimate, a stark contrast to his brutal reputation. It was the touch of a man claiming something delicate and infinitely valuable. "I will not let them," he vowed. "Your power is not a curse to be bound. It is a crown to be worn." His eyes met mine again, and the intensity I saw there stole my breath. "And you will wear it for me." Before I could process the possessive finality of his words, he closed the distance between us. His mouth captured mine. It was not a gentle kiss. It was an act of possession, a brand of heat and pressure. It was overwhelming, demanding, a raw and potent claiming. There was no tenderness in it, only the unyielding certainty of an alpha taking what he believed was his. His lips were firm, moving against mine with a fierce purpose, tasting of the wildness of the mountain and the coldness of his power. A bolt of pure primal shock lanced through me, and for a second, I was just a girl, kissed by a king, and the world tilted on its axis. Then the shadow surged. It rose from the depths of me not with violence, but with a tidal wave of possessive energy that mirrored his own. It was a response in kind, a meeting of two ancient dominant forces. The air in the cavern grew heavy, the faint light from the entrance seeming to dim as shadows in the corners deepened and stretched, drawn toward us. Varen groaned against my lips, a deep, guttural sound from his chest, and his arms snaked around my waist, pulling me hard against the solid wall of his body. He was no longer just kissing me. He was conveying me, drawing the power out of me, feeding on it, and the creature inside me was letting him. It was welcoming this exchange, this violent, intoxicating communion. My hands, which had been pressed uselessly against his chest, clenched in the fabric of his leather breeches. I didn't push him away. I held on, my own muted cry, lost in the searing heat of his mouth. He broke the kiss as abruptly as he had started it, tearing his mouth away with a ragged breath. He rested his forehead against mine, his chest heaving, his silver eyes blazing with a triumphant, feral light. He was breathing heavily, as if he'd just run a great distance. "Yes," he rasped, his voice thick with something I couldn't name. It was hunger and victory and a dark, dangerous awe. "It answers to me." He wasn't speaking to me. He was speaking to the shadow. He stepped back, putting a foot of charged air between us, and the shadows in the cave receded to their corners. I stood there trembling, my lips burning, my mind a chaotic storm. I felt violated and, to my profound shame, exhilaratingly alive. He had kissed me to test my power, to see if he could provoke it. It had been a calculated experiment. And I, and the monster inside me, had responded exactly as he'd hoped. "The hunters will return," he said, his voice regaining its usual commanding tone as he turned away from me, striding toward the ledge of the eyrie to look out over his domain. "They tasted the blood of this pack. They will come back in greater numbers, with more silver, perhaps even with fire. They want this mountain. They want to eradicate us." He looked back at me over his shoulder, his expression now cold and strategic. "The pack fears you now, but when the time comes, they will need you. They will look to your shadow for their salvation, and you will give it to them." He was laying out my future like a map, a future I had no say in. I was no longer Alaris Thornveal, the broken Omega. I was a living weapon, and he was the hand that would wield me. The humiliation I had felt in the circle of ash was a pale, simple thing compared to the complex shame I felt now. I had been a joke then. Now I was a tool. "You will train," he continued, turning to face me fully. "You will learn to call it, to shape it, to command its hunger. You will not be its vessel. You will be its master." My throat was dry. "How?" I managed to croak, the single word scraping my vocal cords. "I don't know how." I had never called it. It had erupted from me in a moment of death and rage. I had no idea how to summon that hurricane again. I will teach you, he said, and the certainty in his voice was absolute. The oath that binds my blood to your power is not one of mere service. It is one of balance. The king and the shadow. One cannot exist without the other. My will can be the anchor for its storm. For the next week, the Eyrie became my prison and my training ground. Varen brought me food and water himself, never allowing anyone else near. The pack remained a distant entity, a collection of fearful whispers I could sometimes hear on the wind. My life shrank to the cold stone of the cavern, the breathtaking view from the ledge, and the overwhelming presence of the king. His training was unlike anything I could have imagined. It was not about physical strength or combat. It was a battle of will. Every day he would force me to stand in the center of the cavern, close my eyes, and reach for the shadow. It is not an animal you call to heal, he would say, his voice a low, insistent rumble that seemed to come from all around me. It is a part of you. It is your rage, your pain, your deepest, oldest self. Find the moment the arrow struck you. Feel the silver burning in your blood. Feel the hunter's scorn. Feel your life pouring out onto the stone. He forced me to relive my near death over and over again. It was a cruel, brutal form of meditation. At first, all I felt was the phantom pain and the terror. Tears would stream down my face, my body would tremble, and my silent screams would echo in my mind. But nothing would happen. Useless, he would snarl, his frustration a palpable force in the air. You let the memory master you. You are not a victim, Alaris. You are a vessel of destruction. Use the pain. Don't drown in it. Turn it into a weapon. His words were whips stinging my pride, stoking the embers of my anger. He was right. I was letting the memory paralyze me. On the fourth day, as he forced me once more to recall the hunter's leering face, the cold finality in his eyes, something shifted. The fear was still there, but beneath it, the rage I had felt in that final moment began to smolder again. It was a hot, clean fury, not just at the hunter, but at Kale, at Lyra, at every wolf who had ever mocked me, at the elders who had pitied me, at this king who was trying to break me down and rebuild me into something he could use. Good, Varen's voice was a low purr. There, use it. I focused on the rage, nurturing it like a fragile flame. I let it grow, feeding it with every humiliation, every moment of shame, every second of my broken, silent life. A coldness spread from my core. The air in the cave grew still and chill. More, he commanded. I opened my eyes. Wisps of shadow were bleeding from my fingertips, coiling in the air like black smoke. They were thin and insubstantial, but they were there. My breath caught in my throat. I had done it. Varen stood a few feet away, his arms crossed over his massive chest, his silver eyes blazing with an intense, predatory focus. It is not enough, he said, his voice flat. It is a whisper of power. I need the storm. Show me the storm. His disappointment was a physical blow. The shadows dissipated. Exhaustion crashed over me, so profound that my knees buckled. I crumpled to the stone floor, gasping for breath. Again, he ordered, unmoved. The days blurred into a cycle of brutal psychological torment and draining failure. I could summon the whispers of shadow now, but I couldn't grasp the cataclysmic power I had unleashed in the clearing. It remained locked away, a sleeping god that refused to be woken by my fumbling attempts. Varen grew more frustrated, his silence becoming heavier, his disappointment sharper. One evening, after another day of failure, he brought my meal and sat across from me as I ate, the silence between us as thick and cold as a winter fog. I was beginning to think he was wrong, that the monster was a fluke, a one-time miracle of desperation that I could never replicate. Perhaps Saoirse was right, I whispered, my voice hoarse from disuse and strain. Perhaps it cannot be controlled. Varen slammed his fist down on the stone ledge beside him, the sound cracking through the cave like a gunshot. The stone shuddered under the force of the blow. "Do not speak her foolish words to me," he roared, his control finally snapping. His eyes flashed, the silver burning with pure, untempered rage. "You are not some mindless beast. You are the heir to the Aska Warger. It is your birthright." He surged to his feet and stalked toward me, his entire form radiating a terrifying, dominant aura. I scrambled backward, pressing myself against the cold wall of the cave. He was a force of nature in his own right, an alpha whose fury could shake the mountain. "You think this is about hunters?" he snarled, leaning over me, trapping me against the rock. "This is about survival. A rival pack from the north, the Stoneclaws, grows bold. Their alpha, a brute named Fenrir, tests our borders daily. The humans build their towns closer and closer to our woods, their silver and their iron poisoning the earth. Our world is shrinking, Ilaris. The pack is dying a slow death, and they are too blind and complacent to see it." He gripped my shoulders, his fingers digging into my flesh. His face was inches from mine, his eyes wild with a passion and a desperation I had never seen. This was the king beneath the cold facade, a leader terrified of losing his people, his home. "I need your power not just to fight our enemies, but to remind my own pack of what we are," he grated out, his voice raw. "They have grown soft, content. They have forgotten the old ways, the old strengths. They need to be reminded of the darkness we were born from. They need to be reminded of fear. And you will be that reminder." He wasn't looking at me as a weapon anymore. He was looking at me as a symbol, a catalyst for the change he so desperately needed. He was asking me to be the monster that would save them from themselves. The raw honesty of his confession, the sheer weight of the burden he carried, struck a chord deep within me. For the first time, I saw past the tyrant, past the keeper, and saw the wolf beneath, a lone alpha, carrying the world on his shoulders. Something inside me, some long-dormant omega instinct to soothe an alpha's distress, rose to the surface. Without thinking, I lifted a trembling hand and laid it on his cheek. His skin was rough with stubble, his jaw tight with tension. It was an incredibly reckless, intimate gesture. He froze. The rage in his eyes flickered, replaced by a stunned surprise. He stared down at me, at my small hand against his scarred face. His grip on my shoulders loosened. The roaring inferno of his presence softened to a low, dangerous smolder. Slowly, he leaned into my touch, a deep rumble starting in his chest. It wasn't a growl of anger. It was something else entirely, possessive, primal, the sound of a wolf recognizing its mate. His gaze dropped to my lips once more, and this time there was no calculation in his eyes. There was only a raw, unguarded hunger that made the first kiss feel like a pale imitation. "Ilare," he breathed, my name a prayer and a curse on his lips, and as he lowered his head to kiss me again, I knew this time would be different. This wasn't training, this wasn't a test, this was a surrender, and I didn't know whose it would be. The world narrowed to the space between our lips. His name on my tongue, my name on his. It was a spell, a binding. When his mouth met mine this time, the world dissolved. There was no strategy, no testing of power, only a desperate, consuming hunger that seemed to rise from the very core of the mountain. He wasn't the king, and I wasn't his weapon. We were something older, a storm and a stone, fire and shadow, two halves of an ancient, savage whole. His kiss was a torrent, drowning me in sensation. The raw desperation I'd glimpsed in his eyes was now in his touch, in the fierce, almost frantic way his lips moved against mine. He tasted of wildness, of sovereignty, of a loneliness so profound it was a physical ache. My hand, still cupping his jaw, trembled, but I did not pull away. I held him, offering a silent anchor in his tempest. He deepened the kiss, one hand sliding from my shoulder to the small of my back, pressing me impossibly closer until I could feel the hard ridges of muscle in his chest and the frantic, heavy beat of his heart against my own. The other hand tangled in my hair, tilting my head back, giving him greater access. A choked sound escaped my throat. a sound of surrender and startling, undeniable pleasure. This was not submission. This was a confluence, a merging of two wild, untamable forces. The shadow inside me did not surge with rage. It uncoiled with a slow, languid grace, like a serpent waking in the sun. It recognized the raw emotion in him, the fear, the desperation, the crushing weight of his crown, and it rose not to destroy, but to soothe. Wisps of shadow, darker and more substantial than ever before, bled from my skin. They wrapped around us, a living cocoon of darkness, blotting out the dying light from the cave entrance, sealing us in a private world of our own making. Varen shuddered against me, a low groan vibrating through his chest and into mine. He felt it. He felt the shadow's touch, cool and calming against his feverish skin. He broke the kiss, breathing my name against my lips, his silver eyes luminous in the swirling darkness. The ferocity was gone, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability that shattered my defenses. He wasn't the Alpha King in that moment. He was just Veyron, a male whose soul was being flayed by the pressures of his world, and he was seeking refuge in my darkness. "It is calm," he whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief as he watched a tendril of shadow curl around his arm. "It feels peace." My heart ached with a sudden fierce protectiveness. He who was the pillar of the pack had no one to lean on. He who was their strength had nowhere to show his weakness, until now. "You carry too much," I whispered, the words flowing from me with an ease that felt both foreign and deeply natural. My voice was no longer a rusty croak. It was soft, imbued with the quiet resonance of the shadows that now answered my call. He closed his eyes, a tremor running through his powerful frame. He rested his forehead against mine, his breathing ragged. "It is the only way I know," he confessed, the admission torn from a place deep within him. We stood there for a long time, wrapped in the living shadow, in a silence that was no longer heavy or oppressive, but deeply intimate. He did not kiss me again. He simply held me, drawing a quiet strength from my presence, from the unprecedented calm of the beast within me. The shadow, my terrifying, destructive power, had responded not to my rage or his command, but to his pain. This was the key, not anger, not fear, emotion, deep, primal, untamed emotion. It was the conduit. When he finally stepped back, the shadows receded, reluctantly dissolving back into me. The dim light of dusk returned to the cavern. The vulnerability in his expression was gone, replaced by his familiar mask of stern control, but something had irrevocably shifted between us. The air was different. He looked at me not as a tool or a curse, but as something far more complex, something he had not yet found the words for. "We begin again tomorrow," he said, his voice back to its usual gravelly tone, but the harsh edge was gone. "But we will do it differently." The following morning, he did not demand I relive my trauma. He led me out of the eyrie and down a different path, one that plunged deeper into the mountain. It was a path I had never known existed. Hidden behind a curtain of ancient ivy, the air grew cooler, smelling of damp earth and stone. We walked in silence, the only sound the drip of water from unseen stalactites and the soft crunch of our feet on the gravelly floor. He led me to a vast circular cavern deep in the mountain's heart. In the center of the cavern, a pool of water, black as obsidian and perfectly still, reflected the faint light that filtered down from fissures high above. The walls of the cavern were not bare rock. They were covered in veins of some crystalline substance that pulsed with a faint inner luminescence, like a sleeping heartbeat. The power in this place was immense, ancient, and deeply calming. "This is the heart," Varen said, his voice hushed with reverence. "The place where the first wolves of this pack were born, where the bond with the mountain was first forged." He walked to the edge of the pool and gestured for me to join him. I approached cautiously, my bare feet cold on the smooth stone floor. I looked into the water. It was so clear it seemed bottomless, and yet it reflected the glowing veins on the cavern ceiling perfectly, creating an illusion of a star-filled night sky beneath my feet. "The Aska Warger is not a creature of rage alone," he said, his gaze fixed on the water. "That is its most violent expression, but it is not its soul. It is a creature of balance, of the earth. It is the mountain's anger, yes, but it is also its sorrow, its peace, its memory. To command it, you must feel not just your own emotions, but the mountains." He turned to face me. "Sit," he said, indicating the edge of the pool. "Close your eyes, don't look for the shadow, listen for the stone." I did as he asked, seating myself on the cool, smooth ledge. I closed my eyes, the sound of his steady breathing beside me a comforting presence. The air was cool on my skin, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the slow, rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the vast chamber. "Breathe," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel through the stone into my body. "Feel the rock beneath you. It is not dead. It is alive. It is a part of you, and you are a part of it." I focused on my breathing, letting the chaos of my thoughts settle. I pushed away the fear, the confusion, the memory of his kiss. I simply existed, a small, warm being in the heart of a great cold mountain. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to feel what he meant. Beneath the coldness of the stone, there was a hum, a deep, slow vibration that was not a sound, but a feeling. It was the mountain's lifeblood, the ancient geological pulse of its existence. I followed that hum, letting my consciousness sink down, past my own skin, through the stone, deeper and deeper. It was like sinking into a deep, dreamless sleep. I felt the weight of 1,000,000 tons of rock above me, not as a pressure, but as an embrace. I felt the slow, patient passage of millennia, the memory of ice and fire that had shaped this land. I felt a profound, unshakable peace, and in that peace, the shadow unfurled. It rose from me without a single wisp of smoke, without a drop in temperature. It was a silent, perfect manifestation of the darkness in the pool. It separated from me, a shape of living night, and coalesced into the form I had seen in the clearing, a massive canine creature whose edges flickered like black fire. But its eyes were not burning embers of rage. They were calm, deep pools of obsidian, mirroring the water below. It padded silently to the edge of the pool and lowered its head, its shadowy muzzle touching its own reflection. The moment it did, the pool stirred. The reflection of the stars below began to swirl, and a faint ethereal light rose from the water's depths. My eyes snapped open. I was still sitting on the edge of the pool, and Varen was beside me, but we were no longer alone. The shadow wolf stood before us, a calm, majestic, and terrifyingly real presence. It was not a monster. It was a god. Varen stared at it, his face a mask of pure awe. He slowly got to his feet, but he did not approach it. He simply watched, his silver eyes wide with a reverence I had never seen in him. The shadow wolf turned its head, its obsidian eyes fixing on me. I felt no fear. I felt complete. This was not a separate entity. This was the other half of my soul, given form. It looked at me, and through its eyes, I felt the deep, enduring peace of the mountain itself. A silent message passed between us, a perfect understanding that needed no words. "I am here. I have always been here." Then it turned its gaze to Varen. It took a silent step toward him, its form seeming to solidify, to become more real, more present. Varen stood his ground, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the knife he always wore at his belt, but he did not draw it. He was the king, and he would not show fear, not even before a god of his ancestors. The Aska Warger stopped a foot from him. It was a head taller than he was, a creature of pure condensed night. It leaned its massive head forward and did something that made my heart stop. It nudged his hand, a gentle, almost affectionate gesture, an acknowledgement, an acceptance. A tremor went through Varen. He slowly, deliberately removed his hand from his knife and rested it on the creature's head. His fingers sank into the living shadow, and for a moment, they seemed to disappear. He did not flinch. He just stood there, his eyes closed. A king communing with a power far older than his crown. "The oath is renewed," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. The shadow wolf pulled back and looked at me once more. It gave a slow, deliberate dip of its head, a nod of respect, of allegiance. Then, as silently as it had appeared, it dissolved, flowing back into me like smoke drawn into a lung, leaving me feeling whole and resonant with a quiet, immense power. I looked at Varen. The awe was still on his face, but it was mixed with something else, a fierce, burning pride. He looked at me as if I had single-handedly reshaped the world. "You did it," he whispered. "Ilaris, you commanded it." "I didn't," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I listened." He crossed the space between us in 2 long strides and pulled me to my feet. He framed my face with his hands, his thumbs stroking my cheeks. His eyes searched mine, and I saw the last of his walls crumble. The king, the strategist, the keeper, they all fell away, leaving only the male, looking at his mate. "You are my queen," he said, the words a raw, undeniable truth that settled deep in my bones. It was not a proclamation of status. It was a statement of fact, a recognition of my place beside him, not as his weapon, but as his equal, his other half. He kissed me then, in the heart of the mountain, and it was nothing like the kisses that had come before. It was not a claiming or a surrender. It was a sealing, a promise made in the presence of an ancient power, a bond forged not of duty or destiny, but of 2 souls recognizing their home in each other. And as he held me, I knew that the hunters and the rival packs were not the only storm on the horizon. A greater one was brewing, right here, between the Alpha King and the woman who commanded the shadows. Returning to the pack was like stepping from a sacred dream into a harsh, waking world. The peace of the mountain's heart still resonated within me, a deep, quiet hum beneath my skin, but the moment we stepped out of the hidden path and into the valley's sunlight, the familiar scent of fear tainted the air. Nothing had changed. They still saw a monster, not a queen, but Varen had changed. And so had I. He did not parade me through the village this time. He walked beside me, his hand resting possessively on the small of my back, a silent, unmistakable declaration to all who saw us. His touch was a source of constant, grounding warmth. It was a shield against their fearful stares, a tether that kept me anchored to the man, not the king. His gaze no longer swept over his pack with cold authority. It was fixed forward, on a future only he could see, a future in which I was the central, immovable pillar. We did not go to the Eyrie. He led me to the king's lodge, a building I had only ever glimpsed from a distance. It was the largest dwelling, built of massive, dark redwood timbers and fieldstone, set apart from the others. It was his home. As he pushed open the heavy wooden door and guided me inside, I felt the finality of the act. This was no longer about protection or training. This was about a shared life. The lodge was masculine and sparse, dominated by a great stone hearth where a low fire crackled. Furs were thrown over heavy wooden furniture, and the walls were adorned with old maps and the mounted skulls of great beasts, a massive stag, a cave bear, a dire wolf from a rival pack. It was a room that spoke of power, history, and a deep, solitary existence. This was the home of a king who had, until now, ruled alone. He closed the door behind us, the heavy thud shutting out the rest of the world. For a long moment he just stood there, his hand still on my back, as if assuring himself I was real, that the miracle in the heart of the mountain had truly happened. "This is your home now," he said, his voice a low rumble that filled the space. My heart, which had been so calm, so sure, began to flutter with a nervous uncertainty. Being his queen in the silent, sacred dark of the cavern was one thing. Being his mate in the harsh light of pack life was another entirely. I was still Ilaris Thornvale, the mute, broken Omega they had all mocked. I commanded a power they feared, but I had not earned their respect. As if sensing my doubt, Varen turned me to face him, his hands moving to grip my shoulders. His silver eyes searched mine, seeing past the surface to the fear coiling in my gut. "They will see," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "They will see you through my eyes, and if they do not, they will learn to fear my wrath more than they fear your shadow." His certainty was a balm, but a small, treacherous part of me whispered that it was not enough. A queen could not rule from behind the king's shield. She had to command respect on her own. Before I could voice my fears, the lodge door was thrown open without a knock. Elder Saoirse stood there, her face a thunderous mask of fury. Behind her stood Phelan and, to my surprise, Kael, the brute who had mocked me so mercilessly. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a strange, desperate resolve. "Varen!" Saoirse's voice was sharp, accusatory. "What is the meaning of this? You bring this abomination into your lodge? Into the seat of our pack? Have you lost your mind?" Varen did not release me. If anything, his grip tightened, his body forming a protective wall in front of mine. He turned his head slowly, and the look he gave the elder was so cold, so filled with lethal promise, that even the formidable Saoirse flinched. "You forget your place, elder," he growled, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "You do not enter my home without leave, and you will address your queen with the respect she is due." Queen, he had said it, in front of them. The word hung in the air, a stunning, impossible declaration. Saoirse's jaw dropped. Phelan looked as though he'd been struck by lightning, but it was Kael who reacted. With a raw, agonized cry, he fell to his knees on the threshold. "My king, forgive me," he choked out, his head bowed to the floor. I did not know. I mocked her, I shamed her, I have dishonored our queen." He was trembling, not with fear of Varen alone, but with a deeper spiritual terror. He had insulted a god, and now that god was to be his ruler. My gaze fell on the kneeling wolf, the alpha who had been the source of so much of my pain. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction. I only felt a vast, weary sadness for the boy he was, trapped in the brutal hierarchy of the pack. "The time for your apologies is long past," Varen said, his voice like chipping stone. "But your fate is not for me to decide." He looked down at me, his expression softening slightly. "It is for your queen." All eyes turned to me, Saoirse's filled with defiant outrage, Phelan's with wary calculation, Kael's with pleading, abject terror. They were waiting. My first test. My first act as their queen. What would I do? What would the broken Omega, now a vessel for a dark god, do to the one who had tormented her? Would I be merciful, or would I be cruel? The shadow within me was silent. It offered no guidance. The choice was mine alone. I took a deep breath, the scent of the fire and the old wood of the lodge filling my lungs. I stepped out from behind Varen, a single step that put me in front of him, facing my accusers. I looked down at Kael, at his broad, trembling back. I remembered the dead branch he'd nudged at my feet, the mind link filled with scorn. I remembered the shame that had felt like a physical cloak. "Get up, Kael," I said. My voice, clear and steady, echoed in the sudden profound silence of the lodge. It was not the voice of a broken Omega. It was not the voice of a raging god. It was the voice of a woman who had found her center. Kael flinched as if struck, but he slowly, hesitantly pushed himself to his feet. He did not dare meet my eyes. "You shamed me," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of the mountain behind it. "You and many others. You saw weakness, and you chose cruelty over compassion. You upheld a brutal pack law that discards the different and mocks the weak. That is an indictment not just of you, but of us all." I let the words settle. I could feel Varen's surprise behind me, his silent, intense focus on my every word. I turned my gaze to Saoirse. "You see a monster, Elder, because you fear what you cannot control. You cling to old laws because you fear the future, but the future is here. and our laws must change, or we will perish. You have no right, Sorsha began, her voice trembling with rage. I have every right, I interrupted. And a flicker of shadow, brief and dark as a passing cloud, crossed my eyes. Sorsha fell silent, her hand flying to the silver amulet at her throat. I carry the heart of this mountain inside me. I am the living embodiment of the first pact, and my king has named me his queen. I turned back to Kael. Your punishment will not be a flogging or exile, I said, and a gasp went through the room. Your punishment will be to serve. You are a strong alpha. From this day forward, you are a member of the Queen's Guard. You will be my personal protector. You will stand by my side, and you will be a living reminder to yourself and to all others that true strength lies not in preying on the weak, but in defending them. Kael's head snapped up, his eyes wide with utter shock. He stared at me, dumbfounded. He had expected death, or at the very least disgrace. He was being offered a position of honor, a punishment that was a redemption. Tears welled in his eyes, and he dropped to one knee again, but this time it was not out of fear, it was out of fealty. My queen, he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion I had never heard from him before. I accept, I will serve you, with my life. I gave him a slight nod, then looked past him to the other wolves who had begun to gather at the open door, drawn by the confrontation. Their faces were a mixture of awe, confusion, and dawning respect. I had not used my power. I had not used my rage. I had used wisdom, and in their eyes, I saw the first flicker of acceptance. Close the door, Varen said, his voice a low rumble of profound pride. Phelan, looking stunned, slowly did as he was told, shutting us inside once more. Sorsha stared at me, her defiance warring with a grudging, shocked respect. She knew what I had done. I had not just pardoned a fool. I had claimed one of the pack's strongest young alphas as my own, binding him to me with a debt of life and honor, turning a rival into my most loyal subject. It was a move worthy of a king. There is a war coming, I said, my gaze sweeping over all of them. The king is right. The Stoneclaws grow bold. The humans encroach. Our pack is fractured by fear and old traditions. We will face these threats not as we were, but as we must be, united, strong. We will not be a pack that fears the shadow. We will be the pack that commands it. The words came from a place of deep, unshakable certainty. I was not just speaking for myself. I was speaking for the mountain, for the Aska Warger, for the future of our people. Varen came to stand beside me, his hand finding mine, his fingers lacing with my own. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence at my side was a silent amen to my declaration. We stood together, a king of flesh and blood, and a queen of shadow and fire, and the new law of the pack was written in that moment. Later that night, long after the elders and a sworn Kael had departed, Varen and I stood before the great hearth. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the beast skulls seem to watch us with hollow eyes. The weight of the day, of the confrontation, of my new terrifying role, settled upon me. Are you afraid? He asked, his voice soft in the quiet lodge. Yes, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. I am not a queen, Varen. I am Alaris, the girl who could not shift. He turned me to face him, his hands gentle on my arms. You were never just that girl, he said, his silver eyes searching mine with an intensity that saw into my soul. You were a seed, waiting for the right storm to break the ground. That girl is gone, Alaris. Look at who stands in her place. He led me to a polished shield hanging on the wall, its bronze surface acting as a crude mirror. I looked, and for a moment, I did not recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes, my eyes, held a depth and a stillness they never had before. Her expression was not one of fear or shame, but of quiet, resolute strength. A faint, almost imperceptible aura of shadow seemed to cling to her form, a mantle of living darkness. I see a queen, Varen whispered, his breath warm against my ear as he stood behind me, his arms wrapping around my waist. He rested his chin on my shoulder, his reflection beside mine in the shield. The Alpha King and his Shadow Queen. My queen. He turned me in his arms, and his mouth found mine. The kiss was slow, deep, and utterly consuming. It was a kiss of promises kept and futures forged, of two solitary souls who had found their other half. It was the sealing of a bond far older than any pack law, a mating of power and passion that would either save our people or burn our world to ash. And as he lifted me into his arms and carried me toward the bed of furs, I knew with a terrifying and exhilarating certainty that there was no turning back. The crown of shadow and fire was mine, and I would wear it for him, for our pack, until the very end. 2 winters had passed. The snows had come and gone twice, blanketing the great redwoods in silence and then retreating to reveal the vibrant green of the valley floor. The moon, my old merciless judge, now felt like a familiar friend. Its light spilled over the king's eyrie, not with judgment, but with a soft silver benediction. I stood on the ledge, a heavy fur cloak clasped at my shoulders, and watched the lights of the pack settlement flicker below. The air was crisp and cold, tasting of pine and the promise of a long, peaceful night. The scent of fear was gone from the valley. It had been replaced by the comforting aromas of wood smoke, roasting meat, and the deep, earthy smell of a pack at peace. The whispers that followed me now were not of terror or mockery, but of reverence. They called me the Shadow Queen, the mountain's heart. They told tales to their pups of the wolfless Omega, who held a god in her soul, who had faced down an army not with tooth and claw, but with the night itself. The war had come, as Varen had predicted. Fenrir of the Stoneclaws, a brute who ruled through fear, had seen our past strife as an opportunity. He had marched his horde of hardened, desperate wolves to the edge of our territory, expecting to find a fractured pack ripe for conquest. He had not expected to face me. I remembered that day with a strange dreamlike clarity. Varen had stood beside me at the head of our pack, his magnificent wolf form a thundercloud of contained fury, but he had not given the order to charge. He had looked at me, his silver eyes filled with absolute trust, and nodded. It was my battle to begin and end. I had not needed to relive my pain or summon my rage. I simply reached for the deep, calm power in the mountain's heart, the peace I had found by the obsidian pool. The Aska Warger had answered. It flowed from me, a silent, rising tide of darkness that bled from the earth itself. It did not form a single beast. It formed a wall, a living, breathing barrier of shadow that rose 100 feet into the air, stretching for a mile along our border. Within it, the stars themselves seemed to go out. From the other side, the Stoneclaws saw a curtain of absolute sound-swallowing nothingness. I had let them feel a fraction of its power, the bone-deep chill, the suffocating despair, the terrifying promise of being unmade. There was no growl, no roar, only a profound and terrifying silence. Fenrir's warriors, who knew only the hot violence of blood and bone, broke before a weapon they could not comprehend. They had come for a fight, not for the end of their world. Fenrir, his own wolf trembling, had bowed his head from across the valley. He had sent an emissary the next day, not with threats, but with offerings of peace. We had not seen the Stoneclaws since. My power was not a weapon of war. It was a guardian of peace, a line drawn in the very fabric of reality that said, "Here and no further." A heavy tread on the stone behind me brought a smile to my lips. I didn't need to turn. The scent of him was as familiar as my own breath. A pair of strong arms wrapped around me from behind, pulling me back against a chest as solid as the mountain we stood upon. Varen rested his chin on my shoulder, his warmth seeping through my cloak, chasing away the last of the night's chill. "The patrols are quiet," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against my ear. "The world is at peace." "For now," I whispered, leaning my head back against his. For as long as its queen watches over it, he corrected, his lips brushing the sensitive skin behind my ear. A shiver of pure pleasure traced its way down my spine. The king and I had found our own rhythm, a balance of power and passion that was the new, unshakable foundation of our pack. He was its strength, I was its soul. He turned me in his arms, his scarred face softened by the moonlight. The silver in his eyes no longer held the coldness of a solitary ruler, but the warm, steady glow of a male content in his den, with his mate. The lines of strain around his eyes had eased over the past 2 years. The crushing weight he had carried alone was now shared, and the relief had made him younger, fiercer, and more devoted than I could have ever imagined. Elder Saoirse brought a request to the council today, he said, a hint of amusement in his tone. I raised an eyebrow. Saoirse, my fiercest opponent, had become my most steadfast advisor. Once she had accepted the new reality, her sharp mind and unwavering devotion to the pack had made her an invaluable ally. She had learned to respect my power, and I had learned to value her wisdom. She wishes to begin a new tradition, Varen continued, to teach the pups the history of the Askawarger, not as a curse, but as a blessing, a sacred trust. He paused, his gaze full of wonder. She wants them to learn your story, the story of the Omega, who became a queen. Tears pricked my eyes. To be feared was one thing, to be hated, another. But to be understood, to have my story woven into the very fabric of my people's future, it was a gift I had never dared to dream of. There is another who should learn that story first, I said softly. A new sound reached us from the entrance of the eyrie, a soft gurgle, followed by a demanding little cry. A smile broke across Varen's face, a rare and beautiful sight that transformed his harsh features completely. Kael, his face now etched with the quiet dignity of his office as captain of the Queen's Guard, stood in the entrance. In his arms he held a small bundle of furs, which he carried with the same reverence he might carry a sacred artifact. She is awake, my queen, he said, his voice filled with a warmth that was now familiar. And she is hungry. Varen took the bundle from him with practiced ease. Thank you, Kael. You are dismissed for the night. Kael bowed deeply, first to Varen, and then even more deeply to me. My king, my queen. He then retreated, his loyalty a silent, steady presence at our backs. Varen and I walked back to the warmth of the fire. He gently passed the bundle to me, and I looked down into the face of our daughter. She had his dark hair and my stubborn chin, but her eyes were a startling, perfect fusion of us both. A deep, shadowy gray, ringed with the barest hint of Varen's silver, like a storm cloud edged with moonlight. We had named her Lyra, not for the she-wolf who had once scorned me, but for the star constellation that had shone so brightly on the night she was born. She was not wolfless, nor was she a mere vessel for the shadow. She was both. When she was happy, faint, shimmering wisps of shadow would dance around her tiny fists. When she was startled, I could feel the faint protective stirrings of a wolf pup spirit within her. She was the future, a new being born of the union between the wolf and the shadow, a living symbol that the curse was well and truly broken. She was not a conflict of two worlds. She was the bridge between them. I settled into a heavy wooden chair by the fire, our daughter nestled against my chest. Varen knelt before me, his large, calloused hand stroking Lyra's soft cheek with a tenderness that still made my heart ache. They said I was barren, I whispered, the memory a distant ghost, broken in every way a she-wolf could be. Varen captured my free hand, bringing it to his lips and kissing my knuckles. His silver gaze met mine over our daughter's head, and the love in his eyes was a force of nature in itself. They were fools, he said, his voice thick with emotion. They looked at a dormant volcano and saw only a cold mountain. I am just grateful I was the one standing here when you finally erupted. I smiled, a true deep smile that reached my eyes. The girl from the circle of ash was gone. Her shame turned to ash and scattered on the wind. In her place was a queen, a mate, a mother. I was no longer defined by what I lacked. but by the impossible, wonderful power I possessed, the power of the mountain and the even greater power of this love, this family. I held my daughter close, feeling the steady beat of her small heart against mine, while my king knelt at my feet. The fire crackled, the wind whispered secrets through the high peaks, and the moon shone down on our valley. The world was vast and full of threats, but here, in the heart of the mountain, in the arms of my family, I was home. The shadow and the wolf reigned together, not in fear or in fury, but in a perfect, enduring, and silent harmony.